So, hey, everybody, we're live, as it turns out.
Yeah.
I'm John Hallway. I'm an associate dean at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm also the executive director of a criminal justice reform center there called the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice. And it's really exciting to be here. The LEF conference is something that we've been participants in and supporters of for quite some time. And I think it's just a really terrific meeting. So we're thrilled to be able to keep it going, albeit virtually. And really excited to have this group here to talk amongst ourselves, but hopefully also to talk to all of you about Sentinel event reviews in criminal justice, and in particular, a case study of 3 Sentinel events that happened in Tucson in the spring of 2020. We have 3 of the people that conducted that review. And in fact, I'm going to, while they're introducing themselves, I'll put a link to the final report that we did. But basically, here's the situation. Criminal justice, obviously, it's a complicated system. There's all sorts of actors happening. There's dynamic information. People are trying to do the best things they can. And inevitably, there are moments where we fall short of the outcomes that we want to achieve. There are moments where we have undesired outcomes, unintended outcomes in criminal justice. And the question that we have asked at the Quattrone Center and that the other 3 folks on the phone have asked is, how can we learn from those events and try to get better over time and reduce the prevalence and the frequency of unintended outcomes over time? What healthcare does, what transportation does, what other complex systems do is they conduct after event reviews. They look at those events not from a perspective of who should be blamed, who should be fired, who should be held accountable. That's a separate process, an important one, but a separate one. But in addition to those questions, what can we learn from those events to help good faith practitioners do better next time? So in Tucson, in March, there was a young man who died in police custody. In April, a second man who died in police custody. The first event, the officers seemed to act within existing protocols. In the second event, it was a little bit more problematic. Actually, there were some similarities to an event that was going to happen in late May in Minneapolis, the killing of George Floyd, also in police custody. And I bring that up because in June, a third issue was discovered in Tucson, which was that the information that would normally be disclosed about the second death in custody in Tucson had not been released. So imagine the challenge that the community is facing, that the police department is facing, to have 2 deaths in custody, followed by the national outcry about George Floyd, followed by a lack of transparency on a similar issue. The chief offered to resign. The mayor did not accept that resignation, and the Tucson Police Department did something that a lot of police departments, frankly, around the country have not yet come to grips with the value of, which is they conducted a Sentinel event review. They brought people from the community together. They brought people from law enforcement together. They brought clinicians in, and the Quattrone Center and Arizona State University came in as moderators, and we conducted an in-depth event review of all 3 of those issues: the 2 deaths in custody and the breakdown of the procedural transparency processes, he said articulately. And we published a report, and we wanted to share that with you. So I'm going to let our 3 participants introduce themselves, but we have Margie Balfour, Tanya Shrozier, and Chad Kasmar here, all of whom were intimate participants in the review, to talk about what worked, what was challenging, and then hopefully to answer questions from all of you who are watching on how we can help other people do what we did and what we thought the value was. So why don't we just, let's see, Chad, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go Margie and Tanya for the introductions.
Sounds great, John. Thank you. Pleasure to be here today and to share some of our misfortune, and hopefully that other professionals throughout the country and communities can learn from our challenges and frankly do a better job than we did. My name is Chad Kasmar. At the time of this incident, I was the deputy chief of the Tucson Police Department. That means I was a second in command. As one of the responsibilities of many within that assignment was I had oversight of a bureau chief who oversaw our Office of Professional Standards. That shop is responsible for investigating all officer-involved shootings, community complaints, and any kind of performance issues or challenges within the department and the community. And in that seat, as as John stated, I had a front row seat to all of the turmoil that was going on across the country, and we were certainly having our own protest that we had our hands full and for weeks on end. And then on top of that, we obviously then had our own 2 in custody deaths that we had to work through with our community. So we'll dive into all the details of that case here shortly, but yeah, I have over 20 years of experience. I've got over 13 years of experience within internal investigations, both criminal and administrative. And so I'm excited to be here and answer any questions you all may have. Margie?
Hi, I'm Margie Balfour. I'm a psychiatrist with an organization called Connections Health Solutions. And we operate the Crisis Response Center, which is a county-owned but mostly Medicaid-financed crisis center, which is the major drop-off center for Tucson Police. And in that capacity, I worked for, I guess, like 6 years now, closely with Tucson Police on all of their various mental health programs, and am very much involved in the community crisis system. And I also oversee quality for our organization for all of our facilities. And so in that capacity, as John mentioned, we were using a Sentinel review process. It's very similar to what happens in healthcare. So I was, able to, and that's another reason why I was able to participate in this. And then of course in behavioral health, we do seclusion and restraint, which is, you'll see was an issue in one of these cases. So, and then I'm also on faculty at the University of Arizona.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tanya Shrozier, and first and foremost, I'm a mother of 6 beautiful Black children. So that's my biggest piece in this process, but I'm also an educational consultant. I'm an elementary principal. I do some other equity work on this side, and I'm also a PhD student in psychology, technology, and learning. And so my piece that I bring to the table is all of those things combined, but also wanting to be a bridge between 2 very polarized groups, and just really wanted to get into building and rebuilding relationships and actually addressing some real issues.
So I think that's actually a great lead into a question that I think might be useful. This is the Law Enforcement and Public Health Conference after all. And so let me ask you, Tanya, especially, in the wake of the George Floyd incident and everything that was to follow, and then to find out that a similar incident had occurred in your town. And then the police department comes to you and says, hey, we'd like to get community support to participate in an event review of these things. So one of the things that we at the Quattrone Center have, run around claiming is that these event reviews can actually be something that heals some of those divides, that promotes trust, that promotes a restored legitimacy for the police department. That's probably not how you're feeling when Chad reaches out to you that first time.
Not so much on the touchy-feely healing, but I have one eyebrow raised and a whole lot of attitude. But I also said to Chad that I really do want to be a bridge because we've got to find a way to come together. And I believe that it's important to have the right voices and the right people at the table so that we can come to some type of an agreement and resolution. And then I think healing will actually happen. And so I was very honest with Chad, and Chad didn't really know me, but I think the rest of the group, came to know that I have a voice. I'm actually going to use it, and I'm going to ask some hard questions. And so I think as long as we could come together in a respectful way, that we could really get some things done. And so I liked everything that Chad shared. I love the position that the department was put in because it was a position of vulnerability. And that's what it took, that we could come together. Chad said, I don't expect you to be our cheerleader. I'm like, great, because I won't be that. And so that made it easier to come in and just be honest and have some real conversations. And so I think that was a huge leap on the department's, on their behalf to put themselves in that vulnerable position, a very transparent position, because I look for that. I look for confirmations in the things that Chad said, and it happened. We had access, and we had real conversations, some tough conversations. And I think that those are the elements that are needed for this to work.
So I love the image of one eyebrow raised as your posture coming into this. And so Chad, let me ask you, right? I mean, I know that there are a lot of people in the community, frankly, who probably don't step up and join this group. And there are a lot who could join it and maybe make it more challenging rather than productive. So what were you looking for in the makeup of the Sentinel Event Review Board?
So, John, so basically during last summer, a very accurate representation from my first interaction with Tanya. You know, what the chief and I recognized quickly was the traditional relationships we had were not working, because we had 6,000 people on our streets. We had buildings on fire. We had criminal damage. We had our main station vandalized. I mean, and obviously then we were immersed in the national level conversation, and we worked for a very progressive chief, Chief Magnus. I mean, Chief Magnus was the first chief in the country to hold a Black Lives Matter sign when it wasn't socially acceptable to do that. Like last summer, we saw a lot of elected officials and police leaders doing so. In fact, he was chastised and kind of banished from a lot of groups for a while when he had the courage to do that in Richmond, California. So, you know, it wasn't like we weren't aware of national level issues. And again, the chief was involved in consent decrees and a lot of DOJ type work. So we thought we were ahead of the game, and then we quickly realized we were not. And so one of my full-time jobs became, you know, going and having those tough conversations in the community and listening. And it was a challenging and, to be candid, a scary time. They weren't safe conversations. I got, you know, was told to park my white fragility and toxulent masculinity and everything that we've been talking about. I mean, they were tough. And so I think the transition that police departments, and certainly the Tucson Police Department, went through last summer was, this wasn't a situation where we were going to do a review and tell the community what we learned. Everybody wanted to have a more intimate conversation about what happened and why, and to share their perspectives. And so that was really the journey our police department was having with our community members, and Tanya was one of those representatives.
So
John, can I add?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to add that I think that it's important to set a context here, because as a Black woman, see, there is no monolithic approach to Blackness. So I don't represent all that is Black. And even for me to position myself to be a part of SERB was a risk, to be quite honest with you, because everyone doesn't share the same views that we should try to collaborate and work together. And a lot of people don't share those views. But I have my own personal integrity about what I did in choosing to participate. I feel like there are many positions to take in order to facilitate change, but my choice was to be a bridge. Everybody doesn't want to be a bridge. They don't care about a bridge, blow up the bridge, right? But I feel like that's my work, because of my skill set, is to come to the table in a strong way, in an articulate way, and let's see the things that we can get done. But I don't judge anybody else who takes their position, who has a different definition of defunding police, you know. And I think my work is different, not better, just different. So I want to just say that everybody does not agree with my position of being here and being a part of that. But I don't judge them, and my hope is that they don't judge me for that.
Yeah, I think that's helpful and an important point. And I think, you know, having come in a little bit later as a moderator, Tanya, I might describe you as a toll bridge, right? Where, yeah, okay, you know, this bridge will be available to you, but first you've got to show your good faith, right? And I think that kind of comes into the listening part. And for that, I might turn over to Margie, right? Because I think one of the really interesting things here is, as you said at the beginning, Margie, that there are a lot of the practice that we're taking here, we're bringing from a clinical environment. And not only is healthcare more comfortable with this process, but I think some of the clinical skills that you have in building relationships with patients who have illnesses of various sorts can be helpful in this arena. So maybe talk about the role of listening in these event reviews, because it's not something that I think of police as really doing all that effectively in a lot of environments.
Yeah, I mean, when you do, you know, reviews like this, you really have to come at it with humility and and it's hard. You have to actually be aware of checking your defensiveness, because your immediate response is to always be, well, yeah, but like, we did it this way because, and it's like, but there was still a bad outcome. And we're not, the point isn't to judge everyone and say, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, but really to to kind of check all of that and then look for the truth of what happened, and then where there's opportunities to improve. So I think in healthcare, that was a struggle. So it's not like healthcare always had it figured out. It wasn't really until around early 2000s that healthcare got serious about this, after a report from the Institute of Medicine came out talking about the, stunning number of deaths from preventable medical errors. And so healthcare kind of had to go through this. Well, we're not different. We are a high risk industry, just like nuclear power and aviation and all of that. And so we need to adopt these practices. So, and then in order to do that, in the healthcare world, the actual root cause analyses, there's laws around that make the discussion in them protected, because everyone's afraid, well, if I say this, we'll get sued, and if we admit that we were wrong, we'll get sued. So there's been a lot of work to try to foster that openness and listening in healthcare. This was it was in some ways similar to what I'd experienced before in healthcare, but it also in many ways different, especially with the community involvement. That was a different wrinkle, and I thought really kind of cranked up that importance of listening. And even myself, like I came in thinking, okay, I'm gonna provide my expertise, and then a lot of the things that Tanya and her and other various community members were saying, I was like, well, my role here is to just listen and learn. So I thought it was, and I thought everyone who was there in good faith about it. That's the thing, is something like this is risky, and that if you've got someone with kind of a bad attitude, that can kind of poison the whole thing. But I was really impressed with how earnest everyone was about wanting to listen and learn.
Yeah, I do think that there are more people than one might think who, when given an honest opportunity to have some of these challenging conversations, really do, want to dig in with them. But it's also true that, I think there have been a lot of initiatives where people say, oh, you tell me this is going to happen, but then you're not going to follow through. So Chad, maybe I see you have your hand raised, but maybe talk a little bit, and as a panelist, you don't have to raise your hand, you can just jump in. But talk a little bit about how you go about building that trust in an atmosphere of skepticism, and kind of what are the tools there that other departments could use to take advantage of the bridge that somebody like Tanya, somebody like Margie are presenting.
Sure. So my advice to law enforcement leaders and community leaders and activists who are watching today or watch this video later is it's really take it simple. Take it slow, make it simple. And what I mean by that is, in our first date with our significant others, we didn't talk about retirement, 401ks and Roth accounts and kids and retirement and all those different things, and whose responsibilities in the house were whose and all those types of things. So the way that we really dove into this was small community groups who wanted to know about what happened. So once we knew we had this investigation, there were certainly details immediately, and we knew what those details were. And so we tried to understand that we had a huge setback and a loss of confidence with the community, was to start having these smaller, 10 to 15 person meetings. And that's how I met Tanya, and that's how I met also Claudia Yasso from Amistades. And it was in those meetings where I really started slow and built momentum and figured out who those right community partners were. Who there were some people who just wanted to yell and speak at us. There were some people who wanted to listen, and there were some people who wanted to actually contribute to community change. And you have to quickly figure out who those people are, because there's a lot of agendas at a time like this, and they're not all healthy. They're not all looking to help bridge these conversations, and they're difficult, scary conversations. And you're right, John, you hit it on the head. Police departments are not great listeners. We're historically good at telling you what we think you want. We want you to hear. And if you're not listening, we just say it a little louder. And this was an opportunity for us, now there was a lot of foundational work. Our review process was through an evolution of a very traditional police review to a broader perspective to what's become the Sentinel Sentinel Event Review Board, which included Tanya and Margie and medical professionals to provide perspective, because when police departments lose credibility, you better bring people in really quick that have credibility, like Margie, who can say, okay, well, let's talk about mental health and really break that down. So they're not hearing it from the police department, or we're hearing from Dr. Tang, who talks about excited delirium. But most importantly, we're hearing from people of color in your community who explain what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a traffic stop, or to have fears and have to have the talk with their children. And, you know, when you're ready to listen to those conversations, that's where true organizational growth occurs. And Tanya hit it on the head. You know, when we do these review process, we also are real time. We're not waiting for this review to occur to recognize the mistakes that we made, or when we had policy in place and it didn't work. We're doing an immediate review at TPD, and then we're making immediate changes. And we also have our academy staff. We're fortunate we have our own police academy. So that staff is present as well. And as they're hearing this information, again, they're not waiting for the report to come out. They're doing real-time changes out at the academy too. And so when we're able to do those changes, even during the course of this review process, and bring that back to the board and say, hey, we heard you last week, here's our policy this week. That's how you start rebuilding that trust.
John, can I add something to something that Chad just said? I think it is so incredibly important to highlight really the value of multiple perspectives being at the table as a part of this conversation, that if you don't diversify who you're having conversations with, all you're going to do is perpetuate what you've always done, see things where you've always seen them, and you're going to have the same problems that you've always had. And so I think we have to, any police department or any community that wants to bring together this type of group, you have to have the courage to invite the voices that you don't really want to hear, that you invite them to the table. And if we come in with a certain disposition of humility and courage and an ability to listen, then you really can facilitate change. Because this is where it starts, when we come into the room and we start developing trust, because to me, trust is built one marble at a time that you would put into a jar. And so that can only happen by little steps. It's how you respond when I say something you don't want to hear. And believe me, when sitting in that scenario, we did this for weeks. I'm looking at faces and I'm making observations, and I'm looking over at Chad like, okay, and Chad would get that sense. You knew when Chad stood up in the back of the room that he knew that something was getting ready to go south. And he would stand up and he would interject. And we just had some tough conversations. But you have to respect that multiple perspectives being brought to the table is what's going to help bring the change.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that. And I think, but just for people who are thinking about the investment that's needed for this, we probably had 12 to 13, 14 different participants. We met over the course of a month, probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 times for like 6-hour, meetings. So these were for, 2 15 to 20 minute incidents, and then the conversation about the transparency policy. So these are very deep dives into incidents, and it does stir up a lot of stuff, and it requires a lot of back and forth. But Tanya, I think the interesting thing about what you just said is it definitely requires the police to hear things that they don't want to hear. It also required, and what I think you and the other community members brought, and what Margie brought, what was the ability to say, okay, we're actually going to really listen to why you, the police, do what you do too. And we may learn that your policies and procedures are not exactly what we would want, but more thoughtful than we had thought, right? That there are reasons why you're doing what you do that maybe aren't exactly what we knew either. And your willingness to hear those rationales, like everybody's got to be willing to do this. Everybody's got to be willing to say, and it goes back to the undesired outcome, right? If what you think is bad people intended this to happen, you might not, then you think you know the answer. It's get rid of the bad people. Right? But if you think nobody wanted this to happen, why did it happen anyway? That opens up, I think, the conversation for everybody to try to learn something. So Margie, I see that you've unmuted, and I don't know if there was something you wanted to add on that or a different point, but.
Oh, well, I didn't mean to unmute, but.
I'm glad you did.
But that I think is a really important point. And, I've been working with the police for, several years now. And I learn something every time that I talk to them about why they do what they do. And I'm like, oh, I never thought about it that way. And I remember at the end of this whole process, one thing that struck with me was Tanya said that that you learn to think about the police as people, and that I thought was really powerful. And I mean, that's kind of what this sort of process can bring, is because, like you said, nobody wanted this to happen, yet it did. And most people are working in good faith with the tools that they have. So I think it was a really important, the whole conversation and the way it was done was really important, I think, for helping all the different sides to at least understand where people are coming from.
Yeah, I to that point, Margie, I think SERB provided an opportunity to have a collision of cultures, if that makes sense. There were so many cultures, the medical, or psychologist culture, police culture, community culture, all these cultures converging together to discuss one issue or multiple issues. I think I was positioned to learn. And I think just hearing from several police officers, I have no idea what it feels like to have the cognitive drain of putting your life on the line every day. Like, I don't want to do that. I am certain that I don't want to do that. But we need it in certain aspects. We need that. We need the protection. And the truth is, if I pick up the phone, I really want you to be here in less than 2 minutes. I do, right? But I also want you to continue to I want you to, as an agency, I don't want you to lose your humanity, because you are still interacting with humans and you're still interacting with people. But I also realize the places where I had dehumanized police. Like, I want absolute perfection. I certainly acknowledge that there is a high level of responsibility. There's a lot of risk that happens, but you do hold someone's life literally in your hands. And so that's, to me, that's such a fine area to balance. And I think that SERB provided me the opportunity to learn, to see that I was doing to others what I don't want them to do to me or to my people, which is to dehumanize. And so I certainly think that every discipline that's represented here on this presentation today all has areas where we can improve. And I think that SERB provides the opportunity for communities to come together. I would like to see there be a SERB with every agency, because I think it would create radical change.
Eli, I see you got your hand up. Is there?
Yeah, no, I'm a policing scholar here at Temple University myself, so this has all been like incredibly, fascinating to hear this approach to things. And I myself, I've been working with the police recently, and I feel like one of the questions that I have towards this is, do you think a program like SERB is increasing buy-in for officers for more progressive sort of reform measures? Because I know right now, different districts here in the city of Philadelphia have very different approaches to the current district attorney, Larry Krasner. Some of them don't like him whatsoever. Some of them think that he's going to make some big instrumental change. And even then, when new reform measures go in, I think one of the most powerful statements that I've heard an officer make is that, well, we wear the same pants, but we don't wear the same shirts, because the Philadelphia Police Department, once you make sergeant, you're in a white shirt and you wear the same pants below. But the blue shirts are the ones who go out and are on patrol and do everything. So they don't even essentially buy in to the policies that are brought forth from, the upper brass, because they no longer think that they're doing the same job. But I think that when these officers get in touch with the community, then they seem to kind of approach this, they're more open to reform things. So do you think that SERB can kind of increase buy-in for things like this?
Eli, great questions. And the answer is absolutely, right? There's only good things that come out of making the time to have the tough conversations, whether it's right in your personal life. Like we overcomplicate this, frankly. All of the applications of having good relationships in your personal lives are applicable to police departments in their community. It's just easy not to do that when you have a big organization and you have a big community and you can justify why you're not spending time doing that. But the challenges you describe are real. And so I'm not going to sit here and tell you everybody was in love and everybody was on board. There's still officers to this day that feel like we ran, 3 innocent officers out of the police department on the Carlos Ring Lopez case. That was a situation where we had policy in place. We had supervisors on scene. We had all of the measures in place for that not to happen. And guess what? We still had the bad outcome. It was what they didn't do. It wasn't what they did. Which cost them their jobs and caused us to terminate them. And that discipline was independent of the Sentinel Event Review Board. But it's a journey. And what I tell people is, okay, when's the last time you made a significant behavior change in your life, be it diet related, behavior related, or you're going back to school, you're doing something that's difficult. Well, large police organizations have an extension of that. And so for large police departments, or even a small police department, to change a behavior, to commit to recognizing the behavior needs to change and then do it, is as hard or even harder than a personal behavior to change in our lives. And so that's the growth pattern that we're on right now. But I'll tell you, what I really want to make clear too, and I think shows where we're progressing, is our Tucson Police Officers Association had a voting seat on the Sentinel Event Review Board and had participated in the iterations up to that. So that's somewhat unique too, because they are part of the voice here. They're part of the puzzle to do better, frankly, and have those conversations. And so, when the union president in our community is supporting and contributing to, then it just expedites the growth within an organization. But, those challenges are ongoing. The only thing for certain is this, again, for folks listening who haven't had the crisis, Margie kind of touched on it. We have an amazingly progressive relationship with Margie and her team, and we've created an environment where our cops can take somebody in mental crisis to Margie's facility and get them real resources instead of taking them to jail. And it's faster and easier for the officers, and frankly, they understand it has better outcomes for the community when we engage her team. But that's been a 10-year, 15-year evolution to get there. And so now is the time in your communities when you're not in crisis, where you can make big gains instead of waiting when we're in crisis. And frankly, once you're in the midst of crisis and you don't have a process right like this, you do have tools, you do have friends throughout the community, but you also have professional partners like John Holloway at the Quatron Center, and Michael Scott from the Center of Problem-Oriented Policing. And my advice to everybody is partner with somebody who can help guide you through the evolution, because there's no way that we could have had the expedited review in such a professional manner and without folks like John and Michael Scott helping us out.
I just wanted to add, you touched on something really important too, is that the discipline was not part of this process. And that's how they do it in healthcare as well, is that's a whole separate process. So whatever is said during these root cause analysis, sentinel event type things are really for the purpose of figuring out what happened so that we can learn from it and prevent it from happening again. If any discipline needs to happen, that's a completely parallel but separate process.
Yeah. Can I add to that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom. No, you're good.
Well, I wanted to add, and this is really to Chad and to Margie. Part of my research right now is on teacher disposition as an educator. So I'm really studying what are the values and the beliefs and the mindsets that teachers need to have to be able to effectively work with students of color and all students, right, to create an equitable learning environment. And so I wonder if it's even possible to have this convergence of these different disciplines of policing and psychology and psychiatry, those things coming together to really hammer out what is the right or the most effective disposition that we need all officers to have, regardless of the color of their shirt, so that we can really prevent these events from happening. Because I really believe that there are things that are happening in a person's subconscious that really are the drivers of what they're doing. And so if we don't tap into what is this person's beliefs, and I mean beyond the psychological evaluation that they go when they become officers, but are we regularly checking in with the belief systems that our officers are working from? Because that, to me, ultimately determines your approach to this Black man when he's in a car. And so, yes, there is an issue of racism and stereotypes, but what do you believe about this person? What are the perceived threats that you have about this person because of the color of their skin? But and ultimately, what is the most effective, the most conducive disposition that officers need to have in order for us to have a truly safe environment? So I would pose that to Chad and Margie, like, what are those elements of an officer's disposition that we need to have in order to really have true safety?
Well, and I think hopefully what a Sentinel event review like ours does is it takes a question like that, Tanya, that's a really important sort of macro question, and it presents you with precise situations that everybody can point to say, no, this is why we need to have that conversation. And these are concrete mechanical things that we can change to help us get to the place you're asking us to be. So what in both of the instances we looked at, we had people who were, one, clearly dealing with a drug issue and potentially a mental health issue. One became clear because the person was able to fight with 4 200-plus-pound officers for more than 6 minutes, which is indicative of some potential drug use. Both men were Latino. And so one of the questions the group was asking was, if these people had been white, would they still be alive? And so we've got public health issues, we've got cultural issues, we've got the possibility of sort of overtones of systemic or institutionalized racism. And what we ended up doing was sort of working upstream to what's the mindset these officers have to have when they're approaching the scene. And so Chad, maybe you could talk a little bit about the recommendations that the group made about dispatch and 911 and how that influences the kind of context that Tanya's asking about.
Sure. I think, a good statement that captures Tanya's question in an area for growth of police departments is when we were having our George Floyd protests, we had a lot of officers, and I'll even throw myself in that. We're saying, hey, we don't see color, we don't see gender, we don't see, we see everybody is equal. Well, when you're ignorant to, that the origins of policing come from slave catchers, right? Or you're ignorant to some of these cultural awareness challenges, and you make statements like that, as I was enlightened last summer and through these challenging conversations, is that it's exactly what Tanya said earlier. A collision of cultures where, we had implicit explicit bias training that didn't get it done, right? That didn't create the awareness of the officers of when the Nana was trying to, not showing her respect, and so our Latino population saw that as being disrespectful, when I saw it as just poor performance. And so one of the best things to come out of our conversations last summer and through some of our community groups and the Sentinel Vet Review Board was the development of a cultural awareness training. And that was where, community members from all different aspects that look different than us that come in and they talk to our staff and they say, hey, here's what it's like to be Asian in your community. Here's what it's like to be a Black man in your community. Here's what it's like to be from the LGBTQ community. And so it's those shared experiences and lenses that we're hoping will have higher level of influence. And certainly not just within the police department, John, as you noted. The reality is a totally underdeveloped and a conversation piece that isn't, had the level of awareness that should is 911 centers. As we know with the Carlos Ingram Lopez case, that call started going sideways and not the way we wanted to when the 911 call came in. And so, and that's actually the seat that I have right now. I'm the interim director over our 911 communication center. And so, I have the opportunity now to all of the challenges that we were discussing last summer, although we had representation from the Public Safety Communications Department, we haven't seen the growth in our specific department that we'd have liked to. And so we're now having those conversations down here of, okay, we're going to challenge when somebody calls and says there's a suspicious person of color walking down my street, we're going to ask more questions before, and if the certain questions aren't answered or to facilitate what's actually being done that's suspicious, we're not dispatching calls for service because someone of color or someone in a hoodie is walking down the street. And that's where the awareness has to come into dispatch centers across the country too, to keep bad interactions from happening between public safety departments and community.
And I just wanted to piggyback on that around Tanya's question about what's the right disposition. And part of your disposition comes from your temperament and your background and all that. But then part of your disposition to that call in the moment comes from what you were told from 911. And, you know, and especially in the Carlos Ingram Lopez case, like me hearing the high level details as a psychiatrist, I'm like, oh, it's clearly a mental health issue with probably a stimulant on board, and this is how you would handle it. But that's not the communication that those officers received in their head. And so, you know, so they're coming in with a whole different mindset of what they're going to do in that case and what the needs are. And so that communication piece is critical. And some of the things that I know Chad's working on are things that were sort of in process, but now are being developed more fully, such as having crisis hotline staff co-located with 911, which actually they had started a process to have them co-located, and they were co-located, but because of COVID, they were taken out, and then the virtual hookup wasn't quite there yet. So just, you know, so many little things that can, like the Swiss cheese model, where there's multiple different holes that, you know, cracks things can fall through and they all line up just right. But those officers, you know, their mindset was influenced by what they were or were not communicated.
So Margie, that's a great point. And, you know, my wife has some friends in town from DC, and we were actually having a pretty passionate discussion about the mental health system and policing. And I frankly just, even our own community, you know, I'm disappointed with the lack of growth and commitment from a lot of different people to look. You know, what we have to recognize is police departments for a long time in this country have become the catch-all. When there's no better solution, there's no better resource. Well, we don't know what to do with it at 3 a.m, send it to the police and they'll figure it out. And one of the biggest tools that police officers have is arrest, right? If a law has been violated and you have probable cause, then you don't have a better tool or better solution than arrest. And so that I'll give, you know, Assistant Chief Kevin Hall, who's over our Patrol Services Bureau, credit for really having the courage to start having that conversation 4 years ago when he created deflection and diversion programs, where he said, look, we're not taking people to jail anymore for personal use of narcotics. That doesn't solve the problem, you know, and so it was an evolution. But the reality is, when we talk about system change, it's whole machine change, right? It's a commitment of communities to go, okay, if we're ready to put the right work in the right hands, which frankly, most police departments in this country are ready to give it back to the right people, like the mental health system, we have to recognize that takes organization, it takes funding, it takes commitment, it takes a whole nother level of challenging conversations around substance abuse and misuse and mental health. Most of us have somebody in our family that's impacted by one or both of those things, and you recognize how challenging those systems are to navigate through. And until we have real growth in those areas and better support of people like, you know, Margie and her team, in better resources and more resources, 12 people, we have 12 community service providers who can go out and not a 24/7 capacity and take off the mental health calls like some of the ones we're talking about today. That's not enough when I have 4 different divisions throughout the city that run the sizes of small police departments, mid-sized police departments. And frankly, I could have 50 to 100 officers working in each of those divisions, 200 to 400 staff members working at a given time. 12 mental health support resources is not enough for a community of our size. And so in the absence of having a legitimate, you know, community commitment to those, to increasing those resources and having them be better organized and accessible, we're still going to have police departments sending 20-something-year-old adults who have received 9 months of training and we're body worn cameras to capture everything that happens. And guess what? We're going to still have bad outcomes because we just haven't had the growth that we need in those different things to have the different outcomes that I think this community wants.
Yeah, and you know, Tucson actually despite, you know, Chad saying that, you know, we need more resources, Tucson is actually, on the mental health side crisis system, one of the most highly resource systems in the country that, you know, people come and look at. And so as there's a lot of momentum though happening to improve these things nationwide. And when we have these, you keep hearing these conversations about, you know, defund the police and move funding to support this kind of stuff. This is my little soapbox. Don't let the healthcare system off the hook. What other type of health emergency do we expect municipal funds and police budgets to fund the response to, other than a psychiatric illness? You know, most of our crisis system in Tucson is funded via Medicaid, and there's stuff in the reconciliation bill that was just passed that incentivizes states, increases their federal match for Medicaid to stand up mobile teams. And 988 which is going to be the 3-digit line for crisis, is being implemented by mid next year. And so there's momentum now coming from both because of 988 and because of the recognition of the need to alternatives to having police be the first, the co-responders. But it's a healthcare issue. And so, you don't let the healthcare system off the hook. And that includes private insurance, which doesn't pay for any of the services that that we were saying a person like this needs. It all, like, you know, we could have treated Mr. Ingram Lopez in our center, and he could have been seen by a mobile team. And if he had private insurance, that money would have come from a pot of money for unfunded people, even if he had private insurance.
So hopefully one of the, you know, I think you guys are hitting on something that is an important part of this, which is, just as it has been in healthcare and in aviation and all these other places, progress gets made one step at a time, right? And the Sentinel event review process is kind of a game of whack-a-mole. And, you know, a mole pops up and you knock it down, and then hopefully that mole doesn't pop up again, but that doesn't mean you're not going to get another mole that you're going to have to address. And so we have a question in the chat which is kind of this safe harbor question, right? In healthcare and transportation, what we've said is, hey, these things are outside the normal litigation process. We don't have that in criminal justice. And so, you know, the question that's asked is sort of, how do you have the conversations that are candid in a way that balances the concerns that agencies or officers might have, that whatever they're saying becomes Exhibit A in some lawsuit? And I'll say, you know, part of the answer to that question was, we didn't interview in our process the individual officers. What we did was we took the existing administrative review process, and we were able to review those documents. And that got us, I would say, 90 to 95% of the way there. And that's what we took. So part of it was, we weren't creating new records about the facts that had happened. That's part one. But I think there's a cultural issue, and Chad, because you're there and you're talking to Chief Magnus, right? I mean, he basically said, damn the torpedoes, and went ahead and did this knowing that that might be the case. So talk about that kind of balancing of priorities.
Yeah, there's really great perspective.
And we've got about 60 seconds left before Eli explodes and shuts us down.
The facts are the facts. They don't get better with time. My advice is, under Chris's leadership, is be transparent about it. I think we choose to see that as a mitigator. And when police departments and individuals are ready to take ownership of decisions that contributed to bad outcomes, we believe that that's mitigators to, rebuilding. It's a mitigator to litigation, but it's absolutely required to rebuild community trust. So you have to put the litigation and the payout second to that. It's far more important.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I might add to that is, take a look back in your jurisdiction and at the amount of dollars you've paid out in civil rights or other litigation, settlements, et cetera, over the past decade. Think about the cost of one Sentinel event review, right? And then wonder, if it had prevented one of those settlements, would you have made money on the deal, right? If the forward-looking accountability that we're doing prevents one of these events going forward, you've saved yourself tens of millions of dollars potentially.
Absolutely.
Who wants to bring us in for a landing? Tanya, Margie?
Yeah, I guess I would just say in closing that it's going to take courage, it's going to take vulnerability in order for this process to be effective. I would challenge every department and every agency represented at this conference to do some self-reflection on whether or not you have the courage and the willingness to step out. If you really want change, change can begin with you.
Well said.
All right, well, thank the three of you, and Eli, thanks for organizing, but thanks for conceiving of the process, participating in the process, generating a successful process, and then sharing it with everybody today. We really appreciate it. It's great to see you all, and look forward to next steps.
Thanks,
All
John.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margie. Thanks, Eli.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.